Here we are, folks. Welcome, welcome. And another Tuesday evening, end of July, and it's still quite interesting. Believe it or not, we've got hot weather here at the moment. And in fact, the dogs have decided to go and lay in the sun. So I have dog basket, but no dogs tonight. But you have to imagine them. But they are outside enjoying the sun. I've got Robbie teed up ready to come in, of course, in a moment or two. It'd be great to have him on. And I'll just put the pre-show on for a second just to give people a chance to get in. Good number already on, and nice to see some new names as well as some of the old faithfuls. It's going to be a very interesting conversation tonight, very important conversation, and coming together of a few themes I think we're going to try and cover this evening, so that should be fun. For those of you interested, the studio's still pretty much the same. Robbie's teed up, ready to come in over there. We've got the multi-view up here, which is where I control everything. We've got the chat up here, and a couple of other computers with other bits and pieces going on that I might show at various points. I'm watching the output over there, and I've also got the controlling computer there for the stream, which is looking good. And already had more than 200 views, so that's excellent. Right, let me take the pre-show off, and we will get going. So let's start the show. Back in a moment. Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the nearly last day of July. Of course, the RBA meets next week, and a lot of interesting conversations. We have Fed, we have Japan, we have Bank of England all talking as well. So a lot of central bank activity. Just to say, Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening, and should be a really interesting conversation. Lots to talk about. And just as I always do before I bring Robbie in, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. It's a general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions in. Specifically tonight, if you've got questions for Robbie, make sure that you use that Walk the Word. That'll make sure that it gets in the queue and we see them. And if you'd like to make a contribution to what we're doing around here, always greatly appreciated. We've enabled Super Chat, and you can also use that to get your question to the top of the list. With that out of the way, let me bring Robbie straight in. Hey, Robbie, how you going?
Excellent, Martin. How are we?
Yeah, very good. Well, great to have you back on. We've got 30 degrees here today. It's the warmest day of the year so far. So, and you've got it cold.
Not
cold
in the
down there.
slightest bit interested. It has been well. The sun came out today, so there was that going for us. But apart from that, it has been a very wintry Melbourne.
Yeah, I heard about that, and it's interesting that the weather's been all over the place here right the way through this year. We've had almost no summer, and then all of a sudden it's sort of popped out for the moment. But look, we're not here to talk about weather or climate change. I want to really drill into this idea that there are a series of orbiting planets at the moment relating to aspects of the financial system. And actually, when you stand back and look at the universe, you can realize that there's a bit of a revolution potentially happening. And I want to try and paint a picture of that revolution with you this evening, and also highlight, I guess, where those leverage points need to be further pushed over the edge to make things happen. But it does look to me as though some of the planets are aligning.
Yeah, well, I mean, the things that we focus on, we're actually seeing real progress, and we should talk about them in depth tonight, because for us it comes down to a continuation of the very first conversation you and I ever had, way back in, when would that have been? 2018, I think.
Yes.
And we talked about the neoliberal revolution and us living in the consequences of that. And the question is, what would change it? And there are actually there are geopolitical developments around change, and that's actually there's a lot of positive stuff, but it's also quite scary where that's going, because that's leading to clashes at the global level between opposing sides, people who, we sort of divide it between the people who want to maintain the dominance of the US dollar and the City of London, Wall Street system, where the banks are in charge of the world, and that's actually what it is, versus the people, and it's actually, we now, from every measure, I think it's the majority of countries want to have a financial system that actually facilitates economic development. And this is quite a great desire people have. They don't want to be, Africans don't want to be poor forever. Asians don't want to be poor forever, and so they want investment, etc. And they're not interested in the London Wall Street system anymore, which they just see as another form of colonialism. So that's setting up clashes on the world stage. In Australia and inside countries, you see these domestic political clashes around the people who want to hang on to the neoliberal ideology because it was hard fought, and they're the ones that's given them the power to scoop the cream off the top, right, of the rest of us. Basically, it's our cream that they're scooping off the top, versus the people who are, we can only talk for the work that we're involved in, the people who are starting to take notice of what we're talking about, because there's a growing recognition out there that you need to have some specific economic interventions with powerful economic tools that can actually rebalance the financial system in favor of the people, because that's what we haven't had, and that's really on the, teetering on the edge in Australia at the moment. The reason I use language like that is it's because of what we've just been discussing in the live chat. If inflation goes up, if the latest measure of inflation shows inflation's gone up, then there's a possibility that the Reserve Bank will raise interest rates again next month. And that's just going to be so crushing for so many people. And it can't be the way it's done. That is not the way, that we're not going to get a future that way if that's the way that this system manages itself, where you've got to crush the soul out of people in order to meet your economic KPIs, right? Whereas instead, we need a revolution in the economy, or you could say a counter-revolution, which is actually how I think about it, because I think actually you can point to plenty of times in the not too distant past when we did things much more sensibly and it worked, and we actually shouldn't have gone away from that. So we went away from it due to a revolution towards neoliberalism. We need a counter-revolution to go back to what worked. And I think those things are coming together now.
Yeah, and it is worth just emphasizing, isn't it, that the experiment, because that's what it's been over the last 30 to 40 years, where the financial system was allowed to let rip, it was deregulated, where essentially large financial corporates set the agenda, and governments stepped back and stepped back and stepped back and said, "Oh, we mustn't interfere. It's up for the markets to be the markets." And what you end up with? Well, what you end up with is, for example, the idea of a 50-year mortgage, which is now being mooted by one of the CEOs who had previously tried to lobby APRA to reduce the mortgage buffer. And they've come out and said, well, we're not going to do that because there's still a lot of risk in the system. So he's now saying,
insane, yep.
Let's go for 50-year mortgages, because that just extends the problem. And of course, it means that banks make more interest over the life of the loan, and it might reduce the payments a little bit, but not very much. And it comes back to a fundamental point, which is, what is the financial system for? Right?
Yep.
And I don't think the financial system is about maximizing the profit and the earnings capacity of money to the benefit of a relatively small proportion of people. Okay, people might have superannuation funds who invest in the banks, and CBA is at all-time high in terms of its current share price. Can't understand why that is, because even analysts are saying, we don't understand why CBA is valued the way it is. It's actually valued considerably higher than JP Morgan, if you look at its relative revenue to price. So there's got to be a different way. And one of the really interesting observations is that you sometimes see events which really cast a spotlight on the problem. And I guess we could start with Crowdstrike as one of the most significant recent events that really cast a shadow. And in fact, I made a show the other day called Cash Transaction Usage on the Rise, despite the bank's worst efforts. And there was another one that I did, which basically talked about specifically Crowdstrike, because basically, wake up, it's an antidote to digital dystopia if you have cash. And as we saw, when in fact systems went down, those with cash were okay. Those with cash, without access to cash, digital only, had nowhere to run.
Well, so let's talk about CrowdStrike, but by starting off talking about CBA, since you raised CBA, because I was in the room in September in the Parliament House hearing on the regional bank closures, and I was sitting behind Matt Common, the CEO of CBA, who whenever I see him looks like he's the cat that got the canary, and so maybe there's an argument to be made that the reason CBA's share price is what it is because investors are factoring in or finding some way to put a value on CBA's influence over the actual Australian government, right? Where the government does its bidding for it, and that's when I've ranted on your show about this before. Matt Common said, "Oh yeah, we fully support cash, etc." And then in literally the next breath, he goes and starts whining that it costs them $400 million a year to distribute cash around the country, when it's their business. That is, that he was complaining about an input to their business. Their business is money, right? That is, and they still made $10 billion after paying the $400 million, right, for their business. And it's, one of the more profitable banks in the world. But it was actually revealing, because it showed you that if they get away with it, they will get rid of cash. That is exactly what they've been trying to do. They're like predators in the jungle who just hunt and prey on weaker beings, and they've decided, the banks decided ages ago, that if they maximize cashlessness, even if they didn't fully get rid of cash, but the more they can get rid of cash, then they get to pad out their profits in quite an extraordinary way. And they've been going for it. They've absolutely been going for it. And when you talk about, just again, before I come to CrowdStrike, when you talk about what you said a little bit earlier about, what is the financial system for? Is it just to maximize profit? Well, what people might get a little bit confused by is that, because the financial system is the accumulative activities of all of us, right? Then most people are going to go through life, most people in business, they're going to try and maximize their profit. I mean, that's a natural thing. It's not about trying to change that. It's not about putting people through a re-education system and saying, oh, no, you can't do that. It's about recognizing that, okay, that's what happens in the economy, but we have this entity called the government, which is something that we're all invested in. It is supposed to represent us, and we all accept it's there to make rules and put boundaries, just reasonable boundaries, on how much profit can be made, and the boundaries are in the form of rules. That's what it's for, so that you don't have, well, what we may be, again, I'm going to come to CrowdStrike, I promise, but other things have just popped up. So what we may be witnessing this week, if people have heard about Rex Airlines. Rex Airlines has gone into a trading halt. Now, I'm a vested interest. I fly Rex Airlines. I was introduced to Rex Airlines by a former premier of a state of Australia who I bumped into at an event, and he told me, you should fly Rex Airlines. And I do fly Rex Airlines. They fly from Melbourne to Canberra a lot. They fly into Canberra a lot. They do a lot of regional routes, but they've also become competition for Qantas and Virgin between Melbourne and Sydney, which is fun. I don't know if people know this. The Melbourne-Sydney route is one of the busiest routes in the world, and it's very profitable for airlines. So they're in that. And if you book Rex, it's really cheap. It's much cheaper than the other airlines, and they've actually just opened up a route to Perth. Now, they're up against an airline called Qantas. Now, one thing you may know about Qantas, if you have been paying attention to the news, they're pretty generous to politicians. They have a thing called the Chairman's Lounge, and every politician gets a membership of this exclusive Chairman's Lounge. And if you're a particularly important politician like Anthony Albanese, your son gets a membership of the Chairman's Lounge. The Chairman's Lounge has been called the most exclusive club in Australia. And this is given freely to politicians. How charitable is Qantas Airways? And what I've heard on the grapevine is happening, though, is Qantas has moved, especially since Rex opened up this route to Perth, where Qantas and Virgin can just milk. I go to Perth too quite a bit. I've got my wife's family's over there, and we get milked on that route to Perth. So Rex has been undercutting that, and so Qantas has moved to kill Rex off. And the question's going to be, Martin, is the Albanese government going to sit on its hands and let that happen while Albanese enjoys his Qantas Chairman's Lounge membership? But that's where you have this tension between a business being a business, and Qantas is a particularly rapacious one, and they will come up with all sorts of justifications why they should be allowed to do that. And okay, well, be a business, but then we, the people, say, okay, government, you set the rules. You make sure those things can happen and can't happen. And so that's going to be an issue in Australia going forward. I do a lot of lobbying in Parliament, and I can tell you there's so many MPs' offices I've been into, and they have these actual models of Rex aeroplanes. And so I'm hoping that means that Rex has a lot of goodwill in the Parliament. They actually might get some form of intervention this week to make sure they don't go under, because that would be terrible. And if that happens, that would actually be a good sign of stepping away from this neoliberal cliff. And we need the government to do the same thing with the banks when it comes to cash, because if you didn't believe it before, you better believe it after Crowdstrike, or you're a goddamn moron. That's all I can say. I mean, there's a million reasons to keep cash, and there's some more highbrow ones where and they're all legitimate. We're worried about our civil liberties and our privacy and all that sort of thing. But strip them all away. We cannot exist in this country in practical terms without it. We just can't function. Full stop. Get your fairy tales out of your head. Get your fantasies out of your head. There will not be a fully digitized world. If it is, it's the end of the world, right? It's bloody DEFCON 4. The minute we go fully digital, turn the lights out, because they're going to go out and we're not going to have alternatives. And we had half of an experience of that a couple of Fridays ago with Crowdstrike. I first saw the blue screen of death on Sky News. And what does it bring home? Where is the manual redundancy, our ability to do things manually, gone? Where is that gone? Right? If I was stuck at an airport that Friday and being told there's nothing wrong with the plane, there's nothing wrong with the pilot, there's people here who can count heads, but they are physically incapable of counting you onto that plane, and therefore everything comes to a halt because some computer's got a blue screen somewhere, because nobody thought, well, as we embrace this wonderful digital technology, which is going to help make things efficient, let's just keep the ability, in case something goes wrong, to do things manually, right? Which actually requires a little bit of keeping investment, but let's just do that, right? That's common sense would dictate that, but they didn't. So many companies have madly embraced this digital revolution and just abandoned all reason and forgot any kind of keeping any kind of manual redundancy. And we can see it's nuts. Well, the biggest manual redundancy is called cash. And I think, if you didn't believe it before, a lot more people believe it now.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the RBA admitted that the use of cash in Australia actually had gone up over the last year, right? And in fact, cash usage has gone up in New Zealand. And last week in the UK, the finance industry Pete Body, spokespeople, said cash utilization is up in the UK as well. And it's interesting that the finance sector in the UK has said, we don't anticipate a cashless society anytime soon, that the use of cash is likely to continue and will continue to rise. And they specifically sheeted it back to a couple of things. One is flexibility, and also the fact that because of the financial pressures that many people are on, the discipline of using cash helped people manage their financial affairs more effectively. And then, of course, they did also admit that the Crowdstrike experience was also another object lesson as to why cash was really important. So really interesting that in the UK, the finance sector is now effectively tacking slightly to accept that cash is still critically important. And of course, in Australia, well, we had the sort of pseudo arrangement with the cash handling entity, although that's still up in the air a little bit. But there is still, from the banks, a strong sense of we want to get cash out of the system. It costs too much, et cetera, et cetera. But despite the fact that they make a mozza out of their business, and the cost of handling cash is a relatively small amount of the total. But just to make the linkage also back to, if you link up lack of cash with a central bank digital currency and a digital ID, then basically you're walking towards that dystopian future, as I highlighted in my earlier show, where effectively everything is under control. Cash gives you flexibility, it gives you freedom, it gives you more financial flexibility as well. And it's something that is a human right to use, and we should maintain that human right to use. So therefore, this is a really important object lesson. So to me, Crowdstrike is a really interesting underscoring of a thing that we've been saying for some time. And by the way, we should also make, ironically, Crowdstrike was actually created by a series of events earlier that actually they were almost on the wrong side of the equation, right?
Well, this is, to me, this is the if I had been stuck at the airport that day, I would have been doubly furious, because I know the history of this company. I think it's a fake company. I can't believe it has got itself into this position thanks to Microsoft giving it some contract where it can have so much impact on the world. This is a company that was set up to put a veneer of expert credibility on the CIA's accusations, oh, such and such country has hacked America. And it was all, look, we're here to discuss economics tonight, but you and I have had lots of geopolitical discussions over the years, etc. And one of the things that our party has fought very hard against is the disinformation that leads to war. And one of the things that inspires me is a speech in 1846 in the U.S. Congress called "Show Me the Spot," and the speaker was a young Abraham Lincoln. And the Americans had just gone to war with Mexico because they claimed that the Mexicans had shot American soldiers dead, and that was a trigger for war. And it's not just Robbie Barwick doesn't believe lies about China. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln didn't believe lies about America, about Mexico. And he gave this speech, said, "Show me the spot where these guys supposedly died, because I don't believe you. You're lying to start a war, because that's how wars start, with lies." But in this modern era, we have cyber attacks, and there's no spot to show. There's no evidence to produce. How would you and I ever know where this cyber attack came from? It is a green light for all the false flags you could possibly imagine. So, and they've banged on, they've hacked, they've flogged these things to death. Oh, the cyber attack from this country, the cyber attack from this country. About 2 months ago, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, came out and gave a speech, and she poured ridicule all over it. And I thought, great, finally someone with real standing is prepared to say, look, this is a pile of garbage, right? Because they claim that China hacked the New Zealand Parliament, and she said, as the expert said, there's no secrets in there anyway, right? So it's just one of those things. But these cyber attacks. Well, so Crowdstrike was a company that was set up by dodgy guys connected to US intelligence agencies to be able to say, look, these experts say it's China, these experts say it's Russia, these experts say it's North Korea, and you could tell how dodgy they were at least by 2000 and I think 15 or something, when Barack Obama and Xi Jinping signed an agreement not to launch cyber attacks on each other's countries. And within days, there was a cyber attack on America, supposedly, and CrowdStrike came out and said, China did it. See, that's that evil, deceptive Xi Jinping signs this agreement, and then he goes and attacks us. No, people, they made it up. This is a fraudulent company that just makes crap up. And then the big one was Russiagate. The big one was Julian Assange published emails of Hillary Clinton's in the 2016 elections, and those emails were horrific. Those emails showed her to be a cold, calculating, evil person who cackles when heads of state are butchered in wars, who started wars, who reveled in starting wars. They revealed things like America funded ISIS to go around on its head-chopping rampage across Syria and Iraq, right? These were all in Hillary Clinton's emails. That's why they contributed to Donald Trump winning the election. So what did the Democrats and that side of American politics do? They had to distract from that. And they said they made it about who hacked the emails. The Russians hacked it. And what was the proof? CrowdStrike said so. CrowdStrike said the Russians hacked them. Now, for your better informed viewers, they probably know that they're much more likely explanation. There was a young man named Seth Rich who was mugged and murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C. that year. And it was considered a random murder when, in fact, he worked in the DNC headquarters. Julian Assange, as the publisher of WikiLeaks, can't say where he gets his leaks from, because that's the whole point of WikiLeaks. It's anonymous. But he was prepared to say it wasn't the Russians. And therefore, it was most likely that guy, Seth Rich. But no, it was Russiagate. This was the beginning of Russiagate. It was the Russians, the Russians. And this is it. I'm telling you, you don't have to, go and pay more attention to yourself if you don't want to take my word for it. And you probably shouldn't take my word for it. But this is a fake company designed to make these kinds of claims for fake reasons. And somehow they're able to leverage their reputation into getting real contracts of real importance in the digital system with the likes of people like Microsoft. And if I was going to launch a class action, I wouldn't just launch a class action against CrowdStrike. I'd go after the big kahuna, Microsoft. They got a lot more money, right? They shouldn't have given this fake company a contract in the first place. And and just what makes it, to me, what's funny is that the hubris of our side, we're so hubristic, we end up believing our own disinformation. And so that's how a company like this can get such an important position and bring down the system. And one more comment on that is people need to also reflect on is the nature of the system. There is a debate now about what the internet should be, because we know the internet, how important it is. Like, we're on the internet now, right? The internet has changed everyone's lives. It's true. And everyone would know, or the nerds would know, the internet actually started off as, a US defense project. But before they knew where it was going to go, there was this ideal of it being a decentralized system, not controlled by anybody, where, all the infrastructure, all the different technology and apps and programs would just plug in and all be able to work and whatever. And the strength of it was its flexibility was the fact it was decentralized and not centrally controlled. But what's happened especially to the American economy, is they have become they are the world's digital superpower, but their superpower has become concentrated in this small handful of companies, which goes against the whole ideal of what the internet's supposed to be. And once those companies become so powerful, and we're talking about Google, and we're talking about Microsoft, we're talking about Amazon and the rest of them, once they become, and I encourage people, if you've heard of Yanis Varoufakis, look at what his stuff about the cloud economy that he's talking about, because what the American companies have especially done is put themselves in the middle of world commerce, so they're the ultimate middlemen through the cloud economy system, and it's now centralized control, and that's what made the CrowdStrike thing have an impact that was way out of proportion to what CrowdStrike actually is and brings to the table. Whereas the countries of the world, Martin, that were already skeptical to that, and they happen to be America's adversaries, Russia and China. Well, China wasn't affected because it decided years ago it was not going to have its internet part of America's system. And the Russians said, well, thanks to America's sanctions on us, we weren't affected because America had sanctioned them out of the system, and that's what saved them from the Crowdstrike outage. Whereas we, good old Aussies, we made ourselves completely vulnerable to this. So, it's not, look, there won't be, I sometimes say one day when we're the Jetsons, you can have a totally cashless society. That may work. I mean, but you're talking about such advanced technology that you somehow you won't have to worry about outages and stuff like that. And we're talking about, I don't know, a century or more away, who knows? But for the foreseeable future, unless it's not just about all the other things, but unless the development of the internet takes a different path away from this concentration of power and control, which is its own vulnerability, then we should never, ever, 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 ever go anywhere near cashlessness. We're setting ourselves up for a terrible fall.
Yeah, and it is also worth underscoring, Robbie, that the recent cash out days that we had in Australia were actually remarkably successful. So, you can look back on the internet and you can see the queues of people actually getting money out and using cash.
Well, I saw politicians doing selfies, the first one on the 2nd of April. And the minute I saw that, I thought, this is going to be big. Because these were politicians that were in government. These were Liberal national politicians that were in government for 9 years and did nothing to say. In fact, they wanted to ban cash themselves, right? Remember Morrison introduced a bill that would jail you for spending your own money if you spent over $10,000 in cash. And we beat them back on that. And then, a few years later, they're taking selfies of themselves pulling out cash. And I think the figure was $500 million was pulled out that day. And I don't know, do you have a figure for the second day yet? I haven't seen the figure for that.
No, I haven't seen that, but certainly the anecdotal evidence is that, again, it was a very popular thing. We'll have to wait for a few more weeks to see the statistics. There was a significant blip, the first one. So wouldn't be surprised to see the second one. And I also, interestingly, I've had a few conversations with people who just, ordinary Australians. And some of them have actually started now giving their kids, money. And they found that the kids are actually much more aware of the value of money when they actually are physically handling it and putting it in a piggy bank and, oh, it's gone. There's no magic money machine. You can't just go and wave a magic wand and create more of it, right? So there's another argument here that not only is cash important in terms of civil liberties and to make sure that it's there when things go wrong, but it also teaches much more about the value of money. And so from an education perspective and from, people not getting sucked into the debt-driven world where the assumption is you can always get more debt, I think it's also pretty important.
Oh, 100%. We, and can I point out from that standpoint, the banks have a nefarious agenda as well. They don't want us to be prudent with money. The banks want us in debt. They'll even come up with 50-year mortgages to facilitate us getting into debt we can't afford, Martin. Right? They're very helpful at helping us get into debt. They want a whole bunch of debt slaves that they're just, milking all the time. They don't want prudent people. They want our teenage kids to only think in terms of digital spending and digital systems. Buy now, pay later, all that kind of stuff. They love that stuff. That's what they want. It goes against it goes against the grain of, well, frankly, centuries of sensible living. My English grandfather, with his Cockney accent, loved him to death. He loved giving us advice, etc. But he loved quoting David Copperfield, because there's a line in David Copperfield where the kindest man in David Copperfield's life was this dirt poor, always indebted bloke named Mr. Mycorba. And Mr. Mycorba said, David, this is the way my grandfather would say it, David, annual income, £20, annual expenditure, 19 and 6. Result is happiness. Annual income, £20. Annual expenditure, 20 and 6. Result, misery. So I must have heard my grandfather say that literally 1,000 times growing up because, they forget the stories they've told you. But these were good lessons. And as you know, I had to move house not that long ago, and I had no real choice thanks to the market. I too had to sign up to the dreaded mortgage. I was already trying to practice what I preached on cash. I can tell you now, it's much more strict now practicing what you preach on cash. I have an arrangement with my boss, the true power in my life, who I'm allowed to go to the ATM and withdraw the same amount of cash each week, and that's what we live on, right? That cash, because everything, it's the easiest way to budget. You know what's in your wallet. And this is sensible, and the banks don't like it. Actually, I just a quick aside. Recently, when I went to do that, I'm a customer of the Commonwealth Bank. Always have been. I signed up for Commonwealth Bank when I was a kid in primary school, like a lot of people did. So where I live in this suburb, there's still a branch of the Commonwealth Bank, and there's an ATM at the front, and that's where I go to get my cash out. And while I was there, it was middle of the afternoon, I saw there weren't that many people. There were people in the bank, but not that many. And there'd been a couple of things that I had to solve at the bank, not urgent things, but I'd put them off for a long time. I thought, oh, well, I'm here. I'll go in and ask to get these things resolved. So I went in, I queued up, and the man in front of me was actually there to get cash out, and he got cash out. And then I explained what I was there for, and they called the guy over, and he took me to one of those rooms they have now, because they're not laid out the way they used to be, these banks. So then this particular gentleman, he helped me solve my problem. And then my wife called, and she found out I was at the bank, and she said, well, what about this thing? She reminded me there was another problem to solve. And I said, oh, can we solve that one as well? And we solved that. And then as I was doing that, and I remember there was a third thing to solve, and he solved that for me as well. And it took about 20, 25 minutes sitting down with this guy. And at the end, I said, well, listen, as someone who's just been part of a 15-month inquiry into bank branches and closures, thank you very much. You've just demonstrated to me how important bank branches are. And I said goodbye and walked out. But here's why I'm telling you the story. Nothing I did at the Commonwealth Bank that day counts as a visit, because I didn't get cash out over the counter. I got cash out of the ATM, and I did 3 non-cash problems in the branch. And the only visits they count are visits that involve deposits and withdrawals of cash. So I needed that visit. That was a very useful visit to me. It was very helpful to me as a Commonwealth Bank customer, but their computers will not count that as a visit. And one day in the future, if Commonwealth Bank says, we're closing down the Glenroy branch of the Commonwealth Bank because it's not getting enough customers, they'll produce statistics which are lies. And we know this because this is what came out of the inquiry. Like they're just with everything else they do, they have this nefarious agenda, and they come up with all sorts of lies to promote their agenda, which is taking away cash, getting us into debt, or closing down branches. And that's what will happen in that case. And that's just, that's how the system works now. We've got to call them out on these lies. And that's why our campaign, as you know, has this dimension of, not just use it or lose it, which is very important with cash, but we need to have the institutions that will protect our freedoms. And that's why we want a public bank. And there's a thing that's just come up that where Andrew G, who's now an independent, and Bob Catter, who everyone would know, have introduced a bill into Parliament to require businesses to accept cash payments up to $10,000. Because over $10,000, it's reasonable to negotiate how they want to be paid. Some of them might, that might be too much for them or whatever. And, it's the least reasonable to have the discussion. So the bill doesn't mandate that. But up to $10,000, it mandates that cash is legal tender in Australia and it should be accepted for all payments. And the thing is, that is going to be an important part of saving cash from the bank's cashless agenda, but it'll only work if there are banks for the businesses to bank it in. The businesses need, if they're going to take cash, they need to be able to bank it. And that's why we either force the banks to stop closing their branches, and that's going to require a big political shift in Parliament, or we set up a public bank, which through sheer competition will force the banks to stop closing their branches. And that's where our campaign for a public postal bank will actually be the thing that makes this fight to save cash work.
Yeah, and just to underscore again that the Senate recommendation from the recent inquiry into regional branch closures included the idea that cash should be badged an essential service.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really important recommendation. Now, of course, it's gone a bit quiet. Sometimes after a Senate inquiry, nothing much happens. What's your latest intelligence in terms of what's happening below the waterline on this?
Well, okay, so some interesting things. You're seeing certain signs. As we would have discussed last time, which was, I think the last time we spoke was just after the Senate made these recommendations, those recommendations are game changers, because if you designate access to financial service as an essential service, but the recommendation is designate access to cash and financial service, which, as I've explained, takes it out of the realm of just the banks could say, oh, we're providing an essential service through digital banking. No. By saying access to cash, the Senate committee made it physical. It's got to be face-to-face banking services. By making that essential service, that's a legal designation that puts a legal responsibility on the banks, but also puts it on the government, right? So now the government has to come up to rise to the occasion. They can ignore this. They don't have to rise to the occasion, but they'll be bastards if they ignore it. Don't trust me. They're capable of being bastards, but they've tried to claim all along they're actually engaging with this reasonably. And then, of course, the second recommendation wasn't an outright recommendation for a postal bank. It was a recommendation for an expert panel to investigate setting up a public bank, including the postal bank model. And that is actually, we were very happy with that recommendation because we understand that, we've got to force this. If we were in government, we would click our fingers and start a bank. Don't get me wrong, but we're turning the Queen Mary here, right? We're trying to change the way these politicians have been indoctrinated and conditioned to think. And so, if you had just said, and credit to Dale Webster here, the independent journalist, this was her idea. Actually, she said, look, and she suggested it to the committee members, recommend a panel to look at it, so that it's a recommendation the government just can't say no to. The government, if you just said to the government, you must set up a bank, the government could just say, no, we're not going to do that. But it's not unreasonable to look at the possibility, right? And so that was a smart idea. Now we put forward, as you remember, Christine Holgate, the former CEO, as a nominee to be the chair of the committee. And we've heard it through the grapevine that she'd be more than happy to do that, to chair this expert panel, to do that. We also put forward the name of Associate Professor Andy Schmulo. Now, Andy Schmulo is from the University of Wollongong. He's a law professor there, but he's very sharp on financial corruption and financial regulation, and he would be an excellent addition to this panel. He gave really good testimony to the Kingston Southeast hearing in South Australia when they had it there on branch closures. But he's also been a driving force behind the PwC inquiry, if people have followed that, and the Woolworths and Coles duopoly inquiry. He's been very powerful in all those. He's very sharp on these matters. So we put that forward. Now, so here's what's subsequently happened. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, I got a call from 3AW, which is the biggest commercial radio station in Melbourne, and they wanted to interview me that morning on a postal bank. And then they called me back, or they texted me back and said, "Oh, we found someone else." And I was a little bit crestfallen, and because no publicity is bad publicity. You got to take every chance you can get. But I tuned in, and it turned out they interviewed Angela Cramp, who's in my place, who's the head of the licensed post office group, who's a good friend of mine, and I got to know Angela around the Christine Holgate campaign back in 2021, which people can scroll back through your videos, Martin, to 2021 and see all our coverage of that. Because that for the regular viewers, they will know how important this channel was to the success of that campaign. So I was very happy that I got bumped for Angela, and so the host of the show, Tom Elliott, that morning spent the whole morning talking about a postal bank, and he said that the government should bite the bullet and start a government postal bank. And he was promoting it almost as if it was his idea. He interviewed Angela on it, and then he kept saying how his father, John Elliott, the legendary Australian businessman, Bag's ass, that guy had been part of a group of businessmen. Now, John died, I think, in 2021. John Elliott died. But before he died, he and a group of businessmen had been working quite hard on a detailed proposal, apparently, to start a postal bank, a government postal bank in Australia, because they too were sick of the banks and sick of the lack of competition in the banks, and they wanted a fifth pillar of a government bank in the financial system. And so that gives you when I'm listening to this, is sort of blowing my mind. But what people should appreciate from that story is there is a broad spectrum of support growing around this idea. And then the following week, I was in Parliament with Glenn Isherwood from our office, and we did meetings jointly with Angela Cramp and Scott Etherington from the Licensed Post Office Group. And we went around Parliament holding as many meetings as possible, impressing on politicians the importance of setting up this expert panel. And not only that, and I'll elaborate on this more in a minute because we should talk about that separately, but also on the fact that we need to move on this postal bank model because Australia Post is shutting down post offices. And we won't have a postal bank if we let Australia Post, or it won't be anywhere near as effective as it should be if we let Australia Post shut half the post offices in Australia, which if it's not stopped, it wants to shut half the post offices in Australia. So that was our message to these politicians. Anyway, I can tell you from those meetings, I can't name names, but some of them were very, very excited about the potential for a public post office bank a panel to look at that subject. And since then, people I know have even reported having discussions with politicians who had previously expressed their fierce opposition to a public post office bank. And the same politicians are now going around saying, well, we really want to back, we need this expert panel up. We need to have an expert panel that looks at this. And so I'm expecting, Martin, that in the not too distant future, this could be a real live thing that starts, looks at all the options on the table about how this would work, right, and comes up with a considered proposal for the government to implement. The government has to set up the panel, but then it'll come up with a proposal for the government to implement. And it'll give us, the public, something else to engage with on this subject. And while that's happening, I'm also hoping that next month, early next month, the Senate establishes a legislation inquiry into the Andrew G. Bobcatter bill on mandate or requiring businesses to accept cash payments, because if that is established, we'll put out the call encouraging everyone, as we often do, to make submissions to that inquiry. And the submissions should say we support the law requiring businesses to accept cash. That's important. But also we need banks to bank it in, and therefore we need a public post office bank. And I think if we can flood that inquiry with thousands of submissions calling for a public post office bank, and while that's happening, hopefully get motion on this expert panel, this advances the agenda in quite a significant way. It's not, I think turning the Queen Mary, you probably get a bit of momentum sometimes at a certain stage, right? Where once you got the turn happening, it's going to happen, and then it can almost become an inevitability. Not that it will ever be inevitable. No one should ever think of it that way, because the banks are going to dig their heels in and fight against this. They're already squealing about it, but we have public opinion, I think, on our side, and also we have the fact that and public opinion informed by their hatred of the banks, and that's a very powerful thing, and the reality of things like what Crowdstrike brought home, etc. So, yeah, those have been the developments since. So that it's looking quite good, and I can even say there's other developments that I can't talk about because sometimes you got to let these things play out. I do like to talk about these things as publicly as I can, but every now and then you got to just allow the process to unfold. But they are very, very interesting. So by the time we get on again together, Martin, there could be some real developments to report.
Yeah, and I guess it's worth saying that some of the models of how a public bank could operate wouldn't necessarily require massive initial cash injection from the government, say. There are various models out there, right? So anybody who says, well, that's just, robbing Peter to pay Paul, there are other ways of doing it. So that's why this idea of having a proper look at the different models is an important next step. But I also note that, of course, when the idea of closing post offices, there were, I think there was one down in Melbourne, huge amount of public demonstration and anger. It was the one in St Kilda that was being shot.
And I went and met with the organisers of the St Kilda protest. And what impressed me the most is I met them after the post office had closed, and they're not going away; they're just starting, because their attitude is, well, we're not. It's not that we're St Kilda, therefore we're entitled. No, we're a community. We're entitled. We're entitled to a postal service. How can you can't take this? And so they're saying to Australia Post, you take away this service. Well, what are you going to replace it with? Because you owe us a postal service, because that's the bottom line here, right? Not that many things are mentioned in the Constitution, Martin. The post office is one, and it is the very definition of an essential service. These guys told me, and it reminded me of the hearings around Australia about bank closures, but they're talking about the post office closure. So I've sort of heard these stories 100 times before, but every time you hear them in a different context, they're always powerful. So they're telling me about the two guys I met with were businessmen. One of them he needs a post office box. He'd been 200 meters from the St Kilda post office, right, where he had his post office box. So they shut down the post office and they say, well, you guys can go to the post offices in the area. Well, so there's various post offices. The closest one is 1.2 kilometers away, and there's a bit further and bit further. And to Australia Post, this seems reasonable, right? Except this business guy, he was a young guy, he's probably got a car and all that kind of stuff. That, like, he can get around. That's not the issue. But he's gone from having a post office box 200 meters away to he couldn't find a post office box at the next closest post office, or the one after that. The one he eventually found is 5 kilometers away. So instead of just being able to walk to the post office in his local area, he has to now get in his car and drive 5 kilometers through city traffic to a post office where he can have a post office bank box, because he needs a post office box, right? And we're talking about one guy. And then, as they pointed out, and we were discussing, multiply that by all the other businesses, multiply that by then the sort of the more niche problems that of sectors of people who get affected, such as the elderly and disabled, right? We all need postal services. And if anyone saw the Channel 9 clip we played on our show last week, but if you haven't seen it, go watch our show, you'll see it. We called it Cash is King and Post Offices are Castles. That was the title of our show. But if Dave Hughes, the comedian, this was unplanned. They're having this protest outside the post office, and he waltzes up to do his post to use the post office. He had to mail something, and He lives in St Kilda, as a lot of hipster type, artsy people like him do, and celebrities and whatever. He lives in St Kilda, and he doesn't want to have to go over a kilometre away to a post office. So what seems reasonable to these former Woolworths, McDonald's and Subway executives who've taken over Australia Post? Australia Post is being held hostage by ignorant buffoons from the fast food and Woolworths and supermarket sector right now, who know nothing about postal services, right? So to them, these things seem reasonable. They do not care about the impact this has on the town, on the community, right? And that's why these people are so fired up. So here's the thing, Martin. There's 90. The St Kilda Post Office was a corporate post office, and I hope people know the difference. So there's two types of post offices. There's corporate ones which are owned and staffed by Australia Post. And then there's the 2/3 of the network, which is these licensed post offices, which are small businesses. And what Australia Post is doing is shutting as many corporate ones as it thinks it can get away with. Get this, one of the reasons for doing it that Australia justifies Australia Post is the rent has gone up. Now, what that means, think about what that means for a second. Every town in Australia, especially every old town, has a post office, and it's probably one of the oldest buildings in town. It's been there forever because the post office was always such essential infrastructure. Why doesn't Australia Post own their own buildings? You know why? Because genius executives 10 years ago decided, hey, we'll boost our profits by selling our real estate and renting it back. And they literally did. They sold the real estate, rented it back, and they claimed they reported the income from the sale in their profit and loss statement. And the government took dividends from those years for their budget. This is self-cannibalism. And these people we're supposed to respect as some kind of freaking geniuses. No, because the chickens eventually come home to roost, and that's now. And so then this generation of genius executives say, oh, the rent's gone up, so we're going to close the whole damn service. Bye-bye. Right? This is unacceptable. And then that's not, so there's this year, 90 of these corporate post offices are being closed. 90. Some of them have already been closed, and the rest will be closed. If you see, I appeal to your listeners now, your viewers now, keep an eye open for this. If you see this happening anywhere that you've come across in your general area, contact you'll probably see indications of a protest. Contact the protest and let them know about the Postal Bank campaign, as I did with these St Kilda guys who loved our solution because they recognize that we've got the solution that keeps all post offices open, right, and keeps Australia Post profitable and keeps banking services for everybody. So, but we need to get all these 90 post office closures to become protests that can feed real heat on this subject up into Parliament, because there's no excuse for it. But you got an example where this is where as usual, the government's sitting on its hands and saying, oh, Australia Post gets to be run as an independent commercial enterprise. There's nothing we can do. That didn't apply to the CEO giving away $4,000 relatively cheap gold watches to 4 executives who landed the best deal in Australia's post history to make the banks pay real money. That didn't apply then. Oh, it's an independent business. They get to make their own decisions. No, crucify her, right? But when the CEO is mass closing as many branches as he can, oh, it's an independent business. That's up to them what they do. And what that CEO has also said, he's going to take the number of the post offices down to 4,000. The regulatory minimum in law is it's got to maintain 4,000. At the moment, there's 4,271. That's 200. So there's 90 corporates that are going to close this year. As part of 271, they're definitely going to close. That's going to affect a lot of communities around Australia, and there's no need for it. We've got a solution on the table. All they've got to do is be prepared to stand up to the banks on behalf of the people. And yeah, you'll see these. I'm just responding to that latest comment that you've put up, Martin. People will see these protests on Facebook, but don't assume we've seen them. We appreciate, so you can contact the Citizens Party. and let us know about them. And better yet, make contact with the protesters yourself. But yeah, we've got a solution on the table. It solves the problem for everybody, makes everybody happy, literally everybody happy except the banks. And are we going to let the government get away with just sitting on their hands while this service is flushed down the toilet? Oh, one last thing. Australia Post has made it absolutely clear that the 4,000 minimum is the minimum of their intention. They are lobbying the government like crazy to change the rules so they can go after lower than that 4,000. They want to shut down thousands of post offices. Gut the country in terms of these essential services for communications, etc. Just gut the country so that this current crop of executives from Woolworths, McDonald's, and Subway can make profits, meet KPIs, and get their bonuses.
Yeah, and the problem, of course, is that within government there are still people who are, well, willingly supporting this demise of critical essential services across the country, and not buying into the concept of access to services on the ground. You know, the inquiry that you were very much in the middle of, Robbie, I was partly responsible for helping to, get it set up in the first place, showed just how important access to those services on the ground across the country are, because every time you close one of those, what you're doing is you're strangling the businesses and therefore the communities in those areas, and essentially reducing the ability of those parts of the country to survive. And that's another reason why this is such a critical fight, because it's all about making sure that we don't end up essentially with an economy that lives in just a few major centres and that's it. There is actually a country out there. And very importantly, we need to find a solution that provides the appropriate services in those regional communities. But a public bank can also do a broader range of things too, because it can, just like CBA did before it was privatized, part of the idea of investing in infrastructure in Australia and investing in housing across Australia. So there's a critical role there to provide finance for businesses and as well as perhaps for individuals, and compete against the commercial banks who are only interested in maximizing their profits and minimizing their footprint. And that's all they're after. So this idea of the public bank, it's way more than just keeping post offices open. It's laying a foundation for a different way of doing banking business.
Yeah, and they're only interested in lending for mortgages into a property bubble. And every time you hear one of these bank CEOs open their mouths to say things like, we've got to, like Shane Elliott's whining about the restrictive lending rules post the Royal Commission. Oh, they've got to go. Or this latest thing we've mentioned already, the 50-year mortgages. They are just an indirect admission from these guys that they know housing is way too expensive, but they're not going to stop lending into it because that's all they're interested in doing. Bugger reality, bugger the consequences, bugger the country, right? Whereas it's up to the government it's the government we elect to make responsible decisions. And if you had a public bank, the sky's the limit to what you could do. A mate of mine, I might name drop here only because I don't think he'll mind. I'm good friends with Evan Jones. Now, Evan Jones is a retired economics lecturer from Sydney University. He taught Albo economics. Albanese has an economics degree. This guy was his lecturer. But Evan is a warrior. He's a champion against the banks and bank corruption. He was cleaning out some clutter. He told me the other day, and he flicked me this article, which I've actually got here, and I just want to quote from it. But this was an article written in 1988 by then Liberal politician Richard Alston. People may remember Richard. I don't know if you do, but he was a Liberal, and he wrote this like 8-page article arguing for the privatization of the Commonwealth Bank. And when he he has this whole list of things in this article about what's problematic with the Commonwealth Bank, why it should be freed from these requirements that it has as a public bank. And when you listen to him, when you go through this list of things that he thinks is problematic, for instance, he complained that the Commonwealth Bank, unlike the private banks like ANZ and NAB, etc., who are expanding overseas, he said the Commonwealth Bank's not expanding overseas. They're just staying at home and serving their customers at home. And he was complaining about it as if that was a problem, because it was like the fact that those other banks were expanding overseas like that showed you how sexy and cool those banks were. Yet this public-owned Commonwealth Bank, it was boring. And so things like this he's listing this. So I just want to read the one on. He also pointed out that Commonwealth Bank was constrained because Westpac had started closing branches, but Commonwealth Bank couldn't do that, right? And so like that was another unfortunate thing that he was, in his view, about Commonwealth Bank. It had to keep its branches open. I mean, heaven forbid. And then I just want to, here's the part on home loans. He says housing loans are a particularly contentious area. The CBA and the CSB, which is Commonwealth Savings Bank, may lend to building societies and to individuals, but are required to give preference for new homes, quote, at the lowest practicable rate of interest. That's what the CBA's rules used to be when it was government owned. So, and you know what? We didn't have a property bubble in those days, Martin. Right? You had institutions like the Commonwealth Bank that did this kind of thing. Now, my wife, Elisa, has recently published some quite detailed studies she's done of public housing in Australia in the times when it was successful, always worked hand in hand with the public bank. The public bank funded the public housing. Now, people who are watching now who are of a certain age may remember the State Bank of Victoria as like this basket case disaster. But get that out of your head. You do not judge a 100-plus-year-old bank by what a couple of cowboys. It's like judging Australia Post by Paul Graham and the current Woolworths CEO, and Subway and McDonald's executives. Oh, that tells you post offices don't work. Well, that's the dumb, idiotic arguments that politicians make to me when I talk about a public bank. Or what about the State Bank of Victoria? Yeah, in its last half a decade, idiot cowboys were put in charge of it in this era of financial cowboys riding roughshod all over Australia. In fact, Trevor Sykes wrote a book called The Rough Riders, right, about that era of the 1980s in Australia, and these idiotic governments thought they should match it, but it collapsed. Yeah, but for over a century before that, it was a rock solid foundation of the Victorian economy, the most advanced manufacturing economy in Australia. And the most amazing thing about public housing and the State Bank of Victoria, the State Bank of Victoria built the houses itself. It didn't just fund them. It was the housing authority. In 1921-22, it built 5,000 houses in 1 year in Victoria. 5,000 houses. When we had a tiny population compared to now, 5,000 houses. I was doing some mental maths the last time I thought about this. At scale, it's even bigger than what the Greens have called for a month or so ago in saying we need about 300,000 public houses in 5 years. If you scale up what the State Bank of Victoria did in 1921, it's even bigger than that. And if you bought one of those houses and then later on went to sell it, you always advertised on your advertising to sell the house that this was quality assured by the State Bank of Victoria. That was a badge of honor on these houses, right? So that's what you can do with a public bank, and it's all variations of that. That's just in that one area of housing. I have to tell this little anecdotal story because I love it. The oldest, people, as I've said, I go to Canberra a lot. The oldest lobbyist in Australia is a 92-year-old bloke named Everald Compton, and he's quite a legend. And I met him last year. And the reason I met him is because I follow him on Twitter, and randomly out of the blue, he tweeted, I support a postal bank. It's like, oh, I've got to meet this guy. And we had a mutual acquaintance. So I got his number, and I met him in Parliament House. And so we're having a good little chat. And he was telling me about his life. Like he's been lobbying for so long. The first prime minister he ever lobbied was Robert Menzies. That's how long this guy's been in the game. But I said, so Everett, why do you support a postal bank? What do you think it would be good for? And his answer really surprised me. He said it would be good for personal loans for elderly people. I said, really? He goes, yeah. Elderly people often need a bit of money for things like, helping pay their grandkids through high school and whatever, fund a holiday, being generous or whatever. And they often just want to take out a personal loan. But the banks aren't interested in that kind of business. What the banks are interested in is things like reverse mortgages and the variations thereof. And there's a new scandal around a particular type of this, just in this area where I am. Actually, it's got in the news a bit, where elderly people, it's not a reverse mortgage exactly, but you talked into it's that you don't borrow, you sell a percentage of your home, but there's a formula where the amount of money you get, the percentage you sell can grow up to about 60% in total, and you actually don't realize how big a chunk you're selling. And of course, it's for your kids to sort out once you die and they sell the property, right? But you think the one case I saw is someone got $200,000, and less than 10 years later, they're owing something like $650,000 or $700,000, right? And these are just variations of reverse mortgages. This is a sort of the thing the banks like to do, right? They like to prey on people's assets. My friend Denise Braley called it asset stripping. That's what they're into, not actually just being helpful to people, but that's what a public bank could do, right? Give out personal loans to people in communities who need them. Focus their lending on what's beneficial to the local communities. And by that, we mean the local small business people, right? The small businesses, they need loans, and they can never get the damn things from the bank. The local infrastructure, local projects, that's what a public bank can invest in. And if you start investing in these areas around Australia that at the moment are suffering from a lack of investment, you can spark an economic renaissance across this country, which is desperately crying out for. It just needs to be seeded with a bit of capital, and the private banks will never do it. Now, once the public bank does do it, Martin, and you see the deserts bloom in a sense economically, you will see the private banks pile back in. They'll want a piece of it, but they'll never do it themselves, right? And that's just the nature of the private banks. That's why they are what they are, but they should not be any kind of priority for the government. The government has its own ability with it. If it has its own tool of a public bank to make this kind of investment, it should just go ahead and do it and let the country thrive, and let the private banks do what they're going to do.
Yeah, and in fact, the banks in their current form are better at lobbying government than doing anything new and different and otherwise, other than milking everybody for what they can take them. They are all over Canberra at the moment, trying to make sure that public banks don't get set up, and they're allowed to do what they want to do, and cash isn't mandated. The amount of lobbying is astronomical at the moment.
Well, it is, and that's where this makes me think about this other thing I wanted to bring up, which is we need to clean out financial corruption in the system. And there's different aspects of that. The best way to do it is to have a public bank. Like just the government can create a center of gravity in the financial system that's not operated for massive profit. Therefore, there's no incentive to rob people or whatever. And it's there to help the economy. And it creates a safe haven for people who just want to have safe deposits and all that kind of stuff. That's what the government should concentrate on, but still got to have rules for the rest of it. And when you look at the amount of lobbying by the banks. They are the chief lobbyists in the country. They have the top politicians in Australia on speed dial. We've talked about this before, the shameful day in November 2022 when between one day and the next, the Greens and Labor had agreed to a deal where the Labor government would introduce $1 million fines for bank executives caught doing the wrong thing. And that was the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald that night: $1 million fines for bank executives. And then 24 hours later, after Anna Bligh from the Banking Association and the CEOs of the big four banks called Jim Chalmers and called the Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones, they dropped it just like that. I mean, that is corruption. That is corrupt power in Australia. That's what we have in this system when you have banks that don't have a public competitor, right? That's why that's one of the reasons we need to keep cash. Cash gives you power, not the banks. It actually reduces the bank's power, right? They want more and more power, and it's up to us and the government to make sure they don't get it. In fact, we take it away from them. And that's why it's so important to have a bank, but we also need to look at the rules and start cleaning out corruption. So apparently I'm catching up with John Adams tomorrow. He'll be in Melbourne. I think I'm allowed to say that. And now John has been, leading a valiant battle against the corruption of the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, ASIC, right? That led to a Senate inquiry. That inquiry came up with some strong recommendations, including the abolition of ASIC and replacing ASIC with a dedicated financial services conduct authority, because it needs to be dedicated because, there are complexities in the financial services you need smart people to stay on top of, and separate that function from just a general companies regulator, the non-financial sector, right? So this was the recommendation. This week, we put out a release, in fact, just yesterday, today actually, we called for the chairman of ASIC, Joe Longo, to be sacked. And the reason why is because he is out there actively arguing and campaigning against these recommendations and saying there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to see here, right? ASIC's fine. Well, no, it's not fine. And one of the things we quote, if you want to see an example of corruption, one of the things we quote is in this press release is the history of Joe Longo. Joe Longo, the current chair, the current cop in the financial system, that's what he is, the top cop in the financial system, supposedly. He started off as as a lawyer in private practice, and his most famous big client back in the 90s was Alan Bond. After Alan Bond had ripped everybody off, right, was trying to get away with it, Joe Longo was his lawyer. And then somehow, quite strangely, in 1992, as part of being Longo's lawyer, Martin, as Bond's lawyer, I'm as mixed up as Joe Biden. Maybe I should retire from this job. Anyway, apart from being while he was Bond's lawyer, he wrote an article for the Australian Institute of Criminologists complaining that the then predecessor of ASIC, the ASC, the Australian Securities Commission, was overreacting to white-collar crime. It was overreacting to Bond and Skase and Laurie Connell and all the cowboys of the 1980s, right? This is what Bond's lawyer, Joe Longo, wrote complaining. And as part of its overreaction, it wasn't respecting the civil liberties of white-collar criminals. That was his argument. Anyway, 1995, he's able to somehow go from poacher to gamekeeper because he then joins the ASC. And in 1996, he becomes the head of enforcement for the ASC. He's the head of enforcement for the Corporations Act in Australia, making sure all the companies obey the law. This is the guy who a few years earlier was arguing in favor of the civil liberties of white-collar criminals. He's now the head of enforcement for the law. In the Senate inquiry that John Adams triggered with his report showing that ASIC was a terrible regulator, basically, chaired by Senator Bragg, November last year, Professor Alan Fels testified, and his testimony was explosive. because he is old enough. He's former chairman of the ACCC. People remember Alan Fels in that capacity. And he's old enough to know how everything worked. He saw this stuff unfold. In 1998, you had this inquiry called the Wallace Commission, the Wallace Inquiry, Financial System Inquiry, chaired by Stan Wallace, and they made recommendations that set up the regulatory structure of the financial system we have today under APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and ASIC, right? So they rebirthed the ASC as ASIC. There was Wallace recommended or wanted to recommend that law enforcement, the role of law enforcement, not administration and making sure companies provide the right data, etc., but law enforcement should go to the ACCC, because the ACCC had a better reputation as a regulator. It was quite effective in its law enforcement capability. They had skilled people in this area. And the ASC or ASIC had Joe Longo. They didn't have a record of law enforcement. It was appalling. And so this was Stan Wallace wanted to recommend it, went to ASIC. And Alan Fels was asked in the hearing last November, why didn't it? And he said, because of lobbying by the banks. Well, he called it the financial services industry, because he said because of lobbying by the financial services industry. He said Treasury, in his view, Treasury was mostly pretty good at standing up to the vested interests, except the financial services industry. That's what one of the most respected men in this area in Australia, Professor Alan Fels, said last year. Treasury, he said, was always soft on the financial services industry. And Alan Fels, went and met Treasury officials to argue that the ACCC should have this law enforcement responsibility. And the Treasury officials they met with insisted, no, it's got to go to ASIC, meaning Joe Longo. It had to go to Joe Longo because he was the head of enforcement and not the ACCC. And then Fels observed in this testimony last November that those two officials that he spoke with that day went on to very high-paid, high-ranking jobs with the banks. The very banks to whom they had just insured would only have a weak and ineffective regulator in ASIC on their case and not a powerful regulator. Now, he's too polite to call it corruption, but that's Australia writ large. That's corruption. And in that period from 96 to 2000, while Joe Longo was the head of enforcement, all the headlines and all the papers leading up to the year 2000 with Adele Ferguson about ASIC was, Adele Ferguson's headline was the watchdog no one fears. Some headline was the dog that doesn't bite, but that doesn't bite, and all this kind of stuff. Then Longo went from ASIC to nearly 20 years with Deutsche Bank, one of them as a lawyer for Deutsche Bank, including in London, one of the most corrupt banks in the world. While he was there, you had future politicians like Josh Frydenberg and Jane Hume were also at Deutsche Bank. And then in 2019, he leaves Deutsche Bank. And in 2021, after the Royal Commission, and you had the then chair of ASIC, James Shipton, had taken the commissioner, Kenneth Haynes, seriously, because Kenneth Haynes said, look, you've got to beef up law enforcement. Why does no one go to jail? He said these famous words, you've got to ask yourself, why not litigate? Take these banks to court. Because previously they were giving him what's called an enforceable undertaking, which is just a legal slap on the wrist that to the banks was a joke. And Hayne had said the reason why the bank's behavior was so appalling was because the cost of being caught was vastly outweighed by the profits from their activities. And while that was the case, they will always do it. That's what he said in his final report from that Royal Commission. And so James Shipton took that seriously. His head of enforcement was this lawyer named Daniel Crennan. Daniel Crennan said infamously at a 2019 Financial Review event in Sydney, he said, the banks should fear us. And I think those 4 words sealed their fate. Because by 2021, around the same time as Scott Morrison got rid of Christine Holgate, Shipton and Crennan were shunted out of ASIC under an expenses scandal. And who did Josh Frydenberg turn to be the new chair of ASIC? The same Joe Longo. And the Financial Review in 2021 described Joe Longo in these words. This is an exact quote. Joe Longo is the business-friendly regulator Treasurer Josh Frydenberg craves. They got rid of they didn't want this proper law enforcement against the banks. They got rid of the guys who wanted it, and they brought in this guy. They brought him back. This apologist for white collar criminals. That is how corrupt Australia is, and that's why, thanks to John Adams, you've had this big inquiry. It's the fourth major look at ASIC in 10 years, including a 2014 Senate inquiry, the Banking Royal Commission, the Sterling inquiry. These were big examinations of ASIC's failings. And so this is not just thought bubbles that this inquiry has come up with. This is building on a big foundation, and they've come up with considered recommendations. And the government and Joe Longo are actively campaigning against them. And we as Australians have got to ask ourselves, how long are we going to put up with this garbage? And as long as you expect it to happen in a demoralized frame of mind, like, oh, there we go again, that's how the system works, it will always happen. We have to lead the revolution to say, no, we don't accept that happening anymore. That's why we're going to fight for the institutions like a postal bank, like, a clean regulator, right? That are going to actually serve the people and make sure the financial system serves the people.
Yeah, the point is it's all potentially very doable, right? There's a bit of a path now being created. I just briefly want to highlight one other reason why the public bank is really, really important, and that's to do with deposit bail-in, because, of course, a lot of people are concerned what happens if the commercial banks get into financial difficulty because of their derivatives exposure, which is bigger than it's been for some time now and is at risk. And there is risk of deposit bail-in. Money held by the public bank, of course, would not have that same risk. And my feeling, I don't know what you think, Robbie, but my feeling is if there was a public bank who said, right, we're going to take deposits from the public, they'd be flooded with money.
Oh, 100%. I mean, the fight against bail-in started small in the sense that there was only a few of us talking about it. And for the sake of the viewers who don't know, that is how Martin and I met. I think I saw your very first post the week the bail-in law passed in Australia. You did a post on it, and of course I was in Canberra that week. I was in the chamber in the Senate chamber when the law actually passed. We'd been campaigning against that bill since for a few months. And what's happened though, now anywhere I go around Australia, people have heard it. Like this is a message that's got through. If you could say, look, this is an institution that guarantees your deposits, right? Not up to $250,000, all your deposits. It will be flooded with deposits. And you don't have to put a guarantee on it, because if it's owned by the government, right, then the government would have to go bust to not honor the bank.
Yeah.
And if the government goes bust, you've got bigger problems than your deposits. Put it that way. Right? It's not that these things never happen, but it's that is the most extreme possible scenario. That's what a government bank can do, and it's just in a very straightforward way. There's just an example of this is when the Commonwealth Bank first started, 1912. It kicked off, and it was attracting deposits and going well, but still a brand new bank. In 1914, you had one of the biggest financial crises in world history happened at the outset of World War I. It was an enormous global financial crisis, and all the banks were teetering. And the way we stopped the run on the banks in Australia, because it didn't happen in Australia, is the Denison Miller, who was the head of the Commonwealth Bank. He made an announcement. Commonwealth Bank stands behind the deposits in all the banks. That was his announcement, right? The government bank backs up all the banks, and that was able to. That and a little bit of a ploy he used. He had his staff. There was a day they knew that there was a danger of a run on the bank, and all the Commonwealth Bank staff were fully prepared. That their job was to process transactions that day as fast as they could, and get those people back out the door, so there would never be a queue. because if the public passing by didn't see a queue, there was nothing to make them panic, right? And the combination of the two things meant there was no bank run in Australia. That's what a public bank can do. That's what it can be, and that is why it's the safe haven against bail-in.
Absolutely. So as we come to the end of the show, hopefully you've sort of seen how some of these planets, war on cash, the need for cash, the need for a public bank, the need for a distribution network, be it Australia Post, the change in the regulatory system that we've got with the inquiry on ASIC and the regulators. It's all part of an overall sort of set of issues that can coalesce a new way to enable the financial system to support ordinary Australians and businesses rather than just the big ends of town. And there's now quite a political tidal wave, I think, for some of these changes. There's more work to do, of course, Robbie. And your channel and all of the stuff that you do is helping to get some of these issues on the table and keep them in focus, because you've got to keep alert and alive. The AFR still does puff pieces trying to go against these trends, but somebody's got to, I suppose. But the point is, we are, I think, at a very important inflection point here, and actually come right back to Crowdstrike. To me, Crowdstrike was actually the final nail in the coffin and the old way of doing things, right? So it was a real wake-up call, and actually it might be to our advantage ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's one that's undeniable. But an example that we're not having it all. We're up against powerful vested interests here. Is things like the AFR doing this puff piece on Joe Longo on the weekend. Remember when it was AFO who attacked us when we were campaigning to stop the cash ban? Remember, Martin, in 2019, we called it the banker's toilet paper. But another example is we're putting out a release tomorrow, warning that there's talk in New Zealand now about privatising Kiwibank. Now, what they're doing is they're not actually saying they're going to privatise Kiwibank, but the new government, the Luxon government, which has betrayed New Zealanders on a bunch of fronts. Actually, New Zealand was proudly an independent, pro-peace, anti-nuclear weapons country, and the Luxon government has brought New Zealand back into the NATO umbrella, which means the nuclear umbrella. It goes against everything New Zealand stood for the last 40 years since David Lange, because they're just following the orders that are coming out of the United States and that. But on so it looks like the same mindset it applies to the financial system. Here's Kiwibank, which is 22 years old. It's been a champion bank since it started. It hasn't been perfect, but it has really brought home to New Zealanders the value of having a public bank. And the proof of that is both when it started, the bank stopped closing branches for the next 7 years. No branches closed for 7 years. And just the other month, the banks have announced another 3-year moratorium on branch closures. Remember, their banks are our banks. Our banks own their banks. And so that's banks like ANZ in New Zealand announcing a moratorium on branch closures that ANZ won't do here. Why the difference? Because in New Zealand, ANZ has to compete with a public bank, Kiwibank. So the New Zealand people want this bank. It's been a champion bank, and the Commerce Commission of New Zealand came out and gave it a big ringing endorsement a couple of months ago, saying that this is the only bank that has any capability to really compete with the big four over there and give them a run for their money. And the Commerce Commission said it just requires more capital from the New Zealand government. And so what this government is using that as an excuse, like a Trojan horse, to say, okay, well, maybe that more capital should come from the private sector. Can't expect the government to do these things, right? And so it's like a depth charge that they're sounding in order to see how it flies. Because at the end of the day, they say money never sleeps. Creditors always have one eye open, and the banks and this neoliberal set, they're not going to change their spots. We have to put them on a leash. And it's just an example. There's obviously some things put behind the scenes that are idiots in New Zealand that are trying to bring that down. Now, hopefully, the Kiwis fight to keep their bank. And the reason we put out a release is because we're pointing out, well, look, it would be particularly nuts for the Kiwis to do it, just as Australia is having a big debate about whether we should do it, because we see that their system is more beneficial than ours, right? This would be a great betrayal, but that's the nature of what we're up against. So um, that's a reminder of reality. That's what we're up against. We have to fight really, really hard, and don't stop fighting. Be relentless, remain focused, and that's how you get breakthroughs.
Yeah, eternal vigilance. And remember that the other side of the argument are cashed up, very aggressive,
Yes, that's right.
will tell lies left, right, and center, and will take no prisoners. So this is not an easy fight, but nevertheless, it's a critical fight. And I come back to the simple, concluding point. This is actually about the future of Australia, the commercial heart of Australia, and the ability of people to actually afford to buy a home and live in the country and do the things that Australians want to do. So it actually does come back to a question of the future definition of what the Australian society is going to look like. And to my mind, that's one of the reasons why this is such an important conversation. This isn't just a theoretical commercial argument. This is about reality for the next generation.
Yep. No, that's spot on, Martin.
Robbie, I want to say thank you very much. Really appreciate all your time this evening, all your thoughts. We've put links and things below for people who want to go and find out more about the Australian Citizens Party. It's all there. They put out very regular programming on YouTube, as well as very informative releases. And I'm sure we'll be back on in the next few weeks to continue the discussions. And as developments happen, we try to cover them. And Robbie, you're always welcome to come back on the show anytime. So thank you very much.
For the next update. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, take care. I'm going to take you offline now and I'm going to close the show. See you later. Cheers. There you go. Hope you enjoyed that. Certainly a very interesting and informative conversation with Robbie tonight, and look forward to another live show next Tuesday. It'll be Damien. We'll be on and looking at the markets. The last month has been an amazing ride. And of course, next Tuesday, we'll also have the RBA and their decision. So that'll also be part of the discussion. So I look forward to seeing you then, and obviously releasing recorded shows the rest of the week. More coming soon. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thanks for all the super chats as well. Greatly appreciated. And also all the comments. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next live show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.